Walt Disney's beginnings were not draped in glamour or privilege, but in the stern realities of early 20th century Midwestern America, where his restless imagination took root amid the harsh lessons of labor and scarcity. Born in 1901, the fourth son of Elias and Flora Disney, Walt grew up in Chicago before his family moved to Missouri, where rural life demanded discipline and responsibility from an early age. His father, a stern and often overbearing figure, expected his children to rise before dawn to complete endless chores and, later, to deliver newspapers in the freezing dark of Kansas City mornings. Such relentless demands might have ground down a less determined boy, but Walt learned to endure hardship while secretly nurturing a sanctuary of creativity within himself. He sketched the world around him, drawing farm animals and caricatures of neighbors, discovering that art offered him both escape and power, the ability to reimagine the ordinary into something extraordinary. Though he briefly attended art classes, Walt's education was piecemeal, a patchwork of jobs, experiments, and self-taught pursuits that revealed both his ambition and his restlessness. He worked as a commercial illustrator, dabbled in cartooning, and began to explore the infant technology of animation, convinced that moving pictures could capture emotions words often failed to express. Yet his first entrepreneurial effort, Laugh-O-Gram Films, ended in bitter disappointment, collapsing into bankruptcy when distributors defaulted on payments, leaving him destitute and disheartened. For a young man barely into his 20s, it was a devastating loss, but it was also an education. Walt discovered that vision alone cannot sustain a business. It must be fortified by persistence, strategy, and a willingness to embrace risk even after failure. This early collapse did not extinguish his ambition, but instead ignited a new fire within him. He internalized the lesson that resilience is the backbone. If bankruptcy was his initiation, then betrayal became his crucible in 1928. When Walt faced one of the most devastating blows of his career and yet turned it into the foundation of an empire. By then, his studio had achieved modest success with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a character that delighted audiences and promised to stabilize the precarious finances of his young company. But Walt, still inexperienced in the legal complexities of contracts, had signed away ownership of Oswald to Universal's distributor. When he traveled to New York to renegotiate better terms, he was stunned to discover that not only would he lose Oswald, but that much of his trusted animation staff had been secretly lured away by competitors. It was a betrayal that cut deeply. He had lost his character, his team, and almost his dignity in one brutal encounter. Yet Walt's genius lay not in avoiding hardship, but in transforming it. On the train ride back to Los Angeles, he turned despair into invention, sketching the earliest concepts of a new character who would carry the weight of his reborn studio, Mickey Mouse. Working with his closest collaborator, Ub Iwerks, Walt brought Mickey to life. And in November 1928, with the premiere of Steamboat Willie, the world witnessed the fusion of animation and synchronized sound in a way that electrified audiences. This was not simply a cartoon, it was a revelation. At a time when most films were still silent, Disney boldly synchronized every squeak, whistle, and laugh, creating a character who moved not just with lines on paper, but with rhythm, melody, and timing. The film became an instant sensation, and Mickey Mouse, cheerful yet mischievous, grew into a cultural icon. Beneath the joy of Mickey's debut was Walt's hard-won lesson. Never again would he surrender ownership of his creations. From that moment on, intellectual property became sacred, and control over characters and stories became the cornerstone of his corporate philosophy. With Mickey's success establishing both financial stability and cultural clout, Walt Disney transformed the 1930s into a decade of experimentation, risk-taking, and relentless pursuit of innovation, a period where his studio became less a workplace and more a laboratory of imagination. At the heart of this laboratory were the Silly Symphonies, a series of shorts that freed animators from recurring characters and allowed them to experiment with mood, tone, and technology. Here, Walt encouraged his artists to test boundaries, to explore animation not merely as comedy, but as poetry. In 1932, Flowers and Trees premiered as the first cartoon in full 3-strip Technicolor, dazzling audiences with colors so vivid they seemed to leap off the screen. Rather than hesitating, Walt had secured exclusive rights to the process for several years, ensuring that his studio alone could wield this powerful new palette. The decision was strategic brilliance. Color became synonymous with Disney, while competitors lagged behind in grayscale mediocrity. Not content to stop there, Walt's team developed the multiplane camera, a technological marvel that allowed animators to layer backgrounds and create cinematic depth. The 1937 short The Old Mill served as its showcase, presenting a storm-tossed world that moved with a realism audiences had never associated with cartoons. These innovations were not technical indulgences but stepping stones, each experiment preparing both the studio and the public for the possibility of animated storytelling on a grander scale. And throughout it all, Walt pressed his philosophy of plussing, his insistence that nothing should ever be left merely adequate. Every scene, every gag, every brushstroke had to be refined, elevated, improved. This culture of constant enhancement did more than raise artistic standards. It institutionalized a mindset of excellence, embedding in a studio the expectation that art must forever be pushed forward. All of these experiments converged in 1937 with the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a project so audacious that Hollywood insiders nicknamed it Disney's Folly, convinced it would bankrupt him. The undertaking required unprecedented resources. More than 750 artists worked tirelessly for years, producing over 2 million drawings, each frame infused with painstaking detail. Walt poured everything into the project, even mortgaging his own home to keep the production alive when costs ballooned to $1.49 million, a staggering figure during the Great Depression. Yet his conviction never wavered. He believed that audiences were ready for animation to transcend novelty and deliver the emotional depth of a full-length feature. When the film premiered in December 1937, the gamble paid off beyond anyone's imagination. Snow White grossed more than $8 million on its initial run, becoming not only the most successful film of its time, but also a cultural phenomenon. Audiences wept at Snow White's death, laughed with the dwarfs, and gasped at the terrifying transformation of the evil queen, proving that animation could evoke the full spectrum of human emotion. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, and the Academy honored Walt with a special award, one full-sized Oscar accompanied by 7 miniature statuettes. The success financed the construction of a new state-of-the-art studio in Burbank, cementing Disney's place as a permanent force in Hollywood. More importantly, it validated Walt's philosophy that the boldest visions, the ones most dismissed by skeptics, often carry the richest rewards. Snow White was more than a film. It was a declaration that animation had grown up, and with it, Disney had transformed from a mere entertainer into the architect of a new cinematic art form. But triumph was never the end of Walt's story, and by 1941, he faced a crisis that revealed the fragility of his paternalistic leadership and exposed deep fissures within his growing empire. For years, Walt had managed his studio like a family, believing that his enthusiasm, vision, and personal charisma were enough to command loyalty and devotion. But as the company expanded and costs mounted, inequalities became glaring. Many animators worked long hours for low wages, while others felt unacknowledged for their creative contributions. Resentment simmered until it boiled over into a full-scale strike. Hundreds of employees walked out, picketing outside the gates, carrying caricatures of Disney characters twisted into symbols of protest. For Walt, this was not merely a labor dispute. It was a deeply personal betrayal. He saw himself as a benevolent leader, the father of a creative family, and now that family seemed to have turned against him. The strike lasted for weeks, drawing national attention and shattering the idyllic image of the Disney studio. In the end, the resolution forced Walt to accept unionization and to professionalize the company's labor practices, transforming the culture from one of informal loyalty to structured, contractual relationships. Yet the wound it left on Walt himself was profound. His trust in his staff was damaged, His reliance on his own judgment intensified, and his leadership style hardened into one that leaned more heavily on control than collaboration. This paradox, that Disney's genius flourished through the talents of others, yet was increasingly filtered through his need to preserve ultimate authority, would shape the studio's trajectory for decades. The strike was not just a labor conflict. It was a turning point that redefined the relationship between art, labor, and leadership within the Disney empire, a reminder that even visionaries must grapple with the human costs of their ambitions. The strike of 1941 left Walt bruised, but history seldom allowed him the luxury of recovery, for within months the world was plunged into global conflict, and the Disney studio found itself conscripted into a new kind of storytelling. During World War II, the U.S. government and Allied forces turned to Disney for training films, propaganda reels, and morale-boosting shorts, and a studio that had once been devoted to fairy tales and laughter now became a factory of persuasion. Projects like Der Fuhrer's Face, Education for Death, and training reels for the U.S. Army Air Forces illustrated Walt's ability to bend animation toward patriotic duty, simplifying complex technical instructions into visuals that young soldiers could grasp with ease. The studio painted insignias for military units, produced reels on health and hygiene, and sustained itself financially by aligning with government contracts at a time when international markets were closed and domestic box offices were unstable. While the war effort kept the company afloat, it also transformed Walt's sense of responsibility. He was no longer merely entertaining children. He was shaping morale, aiding education, and participating in the cultural defense of democracy itself. Yet the war years also strained his company's finances and exhausted his staff, many of whom were torn between patriotic pride and creative frustration at being confined to functional propaganda rather than the boundless storytelling they craved. For Walt, the wartime pivot reinforced an essential lesson. Survival often requires adaptability, and creativity must sometimes serve pragmatic ends until peace allows for imagination to flourish again. When the war ended in 1945, Disney was eager to reclaim his role as a dream maker, but the scars of wartime compromise and the bitter residue of the strike meant that he emerged not as a carefree artist, but as a more cautious, more strategic entrepreneur. The post-war years brought both challenge and renewal, and Walt Disney emerged with a vision that extended far beyond cinema screens, one that would forever alter the relationship between storytelling and public space. Animation, though still central, was no longer enough to satisfy his restless ambition, for he envisioned worlds that audiences could physically enter, spaces where the boundaries between reality and imagination dissolved. This impulse gave birth to one of the most audacious projects of his life, Disneyland. Conceived in the late 1940s and developed through the early 1950s, Disneyland was not a mere amusement park, but a meticulously designed environment that combined the narrative logic of cinema with the immersive qualities of architecture, landscaping, and engineering. Walt called upon a team of artists, engineers, and architects, later known as Imagineers, to transform his sketches into reality. Yet financing such a venture proved daunting, and traditional banks recoiled at the idea of pouring millions into what they saw as a childish folly. Walt responded with characteristic ingenuity, forging a groundbreaking partnership with a relatively small ABC television network. In exchange for creating a weekly program, Disneyland, ABC invested in the park and guaranteed loans, giving Walt both the capital and the national platform to market his dream. This was visionary business strategy. Television was emerging as a dominant cultural force, and Walt harnessed it not merely to promote his films, but to build anticipation for a physical space unlike anything the world had ever seen. By the time Disneyland opened in Anaheim in 1955, millions of Americans already felt a sense of ownership over it, having toured its lands and castles every week through the magic of television. What Walt unveiled was not just a park, but a blueprint for experiential storytelling, a place where families could escape the ordinary. The opening of Disneyland on July 17, 1955, was itself a drama worthy of a Disney film, fraught with chaos and triumph, marred by mishaps yet destined to become legend. Dubbed Black Sunday by insiders, the grand opening was plagued with problems. Counterfeit tickets allowed thousands more guests than expected. The asphalt on Main Street melted in the summer heat, trapping women's high heels, and the plumbing system failed under pressure, leaving water fountains dry. Reporters mocked the fiasco, predicting that the park would collapse under the weight of its own ambition. But Walt, ever resilient, refused to let one chaotic day define his creation. Within weeks, Disneyland stabilized, operations improved, and the park began drawing massive crowds, surpassing 3.5 million visitors in its first year alone. What critics had dismissed as folly became a cultural phenomenon, a pilgrimage site for families, and a living demonstration of Walt's philosophy of plussing. He walked the park incognito, observing every detail, noting every flaw, and demanding constant improvement, from the cleanliness of walkways to the precision of ride storytelling. Disneyland's success was not simply financial. Though it quickly became profitable, it was symbolic. It proved that Walt's genius lay not only in crafting stories for screens, but in building ecosystems of experience where stories could be lived. The park also demonstrated the effectiveness of Disney's multi-platform strategy. Films fed television, television marketed the park, and the park reinforced the brand's emotional grip on the public. In creating Disneyland, Walt had invented not just a new form of entertainment, but an entirely new business model, one that integrated media, merchandise, and real estate into a seamless cycle of cultural engagement. By the early 1960s, Walt Disney had become more than an animator, producer, or even a park builder. He had evolved into a systems thinker, a leader who fused technology, design, and governance into grand experiments that transcended traditional entertainment. His relentless pursuit of innovation culminated in the development of audio animatronics, lifelike robotic figures that could perform with uncanny precision, blending artistry and engineering to create illusions of reality. Attractions such as the Enchanted Tiki Room and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, showcased at the 1964 New York World's Fair, demonstrated Disney's capacity to fuse storytelling with cutting-edge technology, pushing the limits of what audiences believe possible in a themed environment. These projects did more than amaze. They positioned Disney as a pioneer of experiential robotics, laying the groundwork for decades of innovation in interactive entertainment. Yet Walt's ambitions reached even further. In the mid-1960s, he began envisioning the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, or Epcot, not as a theme park, but as a living city of the future, a constantly evolving laboratory where new technologies, transportation systems, and urban planning models could be tested in real time. To realize this vision, Walt secured unprecedented autonomy by persuading Florida lawmakers to establish the Reedy Creek Improvement District, effectively granting Disney World the powers of a municipal government. This was more than shrewd business. It was visionary governance, ensuring that his company could innovate without bureaucratic obstacles. Walt's focus on Epcot revealed his deepest belief that imagination should not only entertain, but also solve real-world problems, guiding humanity toward progress. Though he would not live to see it completed, the Epcot dream illustrated the scale of his ambition, a testament to a man who never stopped seeking to expand the boundaries of what was possible. Walt Disney's leadership during this final decade of his life showcased the contradictions and strengths that had always defined him. The dreamer who refused to compromise, the businessman who embraced risk with personal stakes, and the cultural architect who believed stories could reshape not just entertainment, but society itself. By this time, he was the most honored individual in the history of cinema, having won 22 Academy Awards and numerous other accolades. Yet he remained restless, always demanding more of himself and those around him. His philosophy of plussing extended to every dimension of his empire, from the cleanliness of Disneyland's restrooms to the complexity of an audio animatronic gesture. He refused to let his company stagnate, insisting that innovation must be a constant, not a rarity. Yet, beneath the triumphs, his health was deteriorating. The years of tireless work and heavy smoking taking their toll. Even so, in his final public appearances, he spoke not of endings, but of beginnings, of Epcot, of future expansions, of dreams that would outlive him. When he died in December 1966, the world mourned not just a filmmaker, but a visionary whose impact reached into the very fabric of modern culture. His legacy was not confined to Mickey Mouse or even to Disneyland, but to the entire philosophy he embodied. That imagination, when paired with courage and persistence, could change industries, reshape societies, and enchant generations. In Walt Disney, the world glimpsed the rare union of artistry and enterprise, a man who turned storytelling into empire building, and who taught us that the pursuit of dreams is not an escape from reality, but a way of transforming it. In examining Walt Disney's leadership style, it becomes clear that he embodied a paradoxical blend of visionary generosity and uncompromising authority, a duality that shaped not only his studio, but the culture of the entertainment industry itself. He was a leader who inspired devotion through sheer passion, rallying his teams with speeches that painted the future in colors so vivid they felt tangible. Yet he was also a relentless perfectionist who scrutinized every detail, often to the point of exhaustion. To his employees, he could be both a source of boundless inspiration and a figure of fear, for he demanded excellence at a level few had ever encountered. His philosophy of plussing meant that no idea, however brilliant, was ever finished. It could always be refined, improved, elevated. In practice, this meant late nights, endless revisions, and moments of frustration. Yet it also meant that Disney projects consistently surpassed audience expectations, creating a standard of quality that competitors could rarely match. This duality produced a culture of innovation, where artists and engineers pushed themselves beyond their own limits, but also left scars, as many employees struggled under the weight of his perfectionism. Still, what distinguished Walt was not merely his insistence on high standards, but his willingness to take risks alongside his team. He invested his own money, mortgaged his assets, and put his reputation on the line, signaling to his workers that he demanded no sacrifice he would not make himself. This blend of authoritarian control and personal vulnerability created a unique form of leadership, one that propelled Disney to heights no one else dared to imagine. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Walt Disney's entrepreneurial journey was his ability to transform adversity into advantage, to reframe setbacks as stepping stones toward reinvention. Time and again, he encountered obstacles that would have crushed lesser men. The bankruptcy of Laugh-O-Gram, the betrayal of Oswald, the strike that fractured his studio, the wartime diversion into propaganda, the near financial ruin of Snow White, the skepticism that greeted Disneyland. Each moment of crisis presented him with a choice: retreat into bitterness or press forward with renewed determination. Walt always chose the latter, and in doing so, he developed a mindset that viewed risk not as something to be feared, but as the currency of progress. His resilience was not passive endurance, but active adaptation, a willingness to rethink, reframe, and reimagine his strategies until they aligned with opportunity. This mindset explains why he was consistently the first to adopt untested technologies, synchronized sound, Technicolor, the multiplane camera, audio animatronics, because he saw in them not peril, but possibility. It also explains his unconventional financing strategies, from leveraging television partnerships to borrowing against life insurance policies, maneuvers that demonstrated both boldness and resourcefulness. In Walt Disney's world, risk was not an obstacle, but a lever, a force that, if applied with courage and vision, could catapult him and his company into uncharted territories of success. Disney's empire was not built on films or parks alone, but on a masterful integration of multiple revenue streams, a business model that became the prototype for the modern entertainment conglomerate. The very beginning. He understood that a character like Mickey Mouse could not live solely on the screen. It had to leap into merchandise, comic strips, and eventually television, creating a cycle of visibility and revenue that reinforced itself. By the mid-1930s, Disney's licensing agreements generated millions in merchandise sales, stabilizing the company during economic downturns and proving that intellectual property could be as profitable off-screen as on. This principle extended into every dimension of his empire. Films fed television, television promoted theme parks, parks inspired new films, and all of it fueled a merchandising machine that extended Disney's reach into households around the world. The creation of Buena Vista Distribution in 1953 further tightened control, ensuring that profits remained within the company rather than leaking to external distributors. The television partnership with ABC to finance Disneyland was not merely a clever solution to a cash problem, but a masterstroke in brand synergy, turning weekly broadcasts into a national advertisement for the park while embedding Disney into the fabric of American family life. What Walt had built was not just a studio or a park, but a self-reinforcing ecosystem, a cultural machine where every part fed the others, multiplying the power of each. This holistic model of storytelling, distribution, and merchandising laid the foundation for the transmedia empires of the 21st century, from Marvel to Star Wars, all of which trace their lineage back to Walt Disney's pioneering integration of creativity and commerce. Yet beyond the mechanics of business, Walt Disney's deepest contribution may lie in the way his personal vision reshaped cultural expectations, forging a brand identity that became synonymous with quality, wonder, and family. Entertainment. He insisted that Disney stories would be clean, wholesome, and uplifting, not because he was naive, but because he understood that in a fractured world, audiences yearned for safe havens of imagination. He rejected cynicism and vulgarity, instead investing in narratives that celebrated courage, kindness, and the triumph of good over evil. In doing so, he elevated animation and entertainment from trivial distractions to moral touchstones, places where values were taught and reinforced. His parks embodied this same ethos. Disneyland was designed as a sanctuary where families could gather without fear of danger or decay, a meticulously maintained world where reality was polished into idealism. This insistence on cleanliness, order, and joy became part of the Disney standard, influencing not only his company, but the entire industry, which came to see family-friendly entertainment as both a moral and a profitable path. Walt's personal vision, born of his own longing for escape from hardship, became a global promise that within Disney spaces, whether on screen or in the physical world, people could step into a better, brighter version of life, if only for a moment. Transformative moments defined Walt Disney's career, and each carried long-term consequences that reshaped the trajectory of both his company and the broader industry. The loss of Oswald taught him to guard intellectual property with ferocity, a principle that later enabled Disney to build franchises of staggering durability. The gamble on Snow White proved that animation could command the box office, paving the way for a tradition of animated features that continues to this day. The strike of 1941 forced the studio to professionalize, embedding labor relations into the structure of Hollywood's creative economy. The wartime years expanded Disney's reach into government and education, demonstrating the versatility of his medium. The ABC partnership to finance Disneyland illustrated how cross-industry collaboration could unlock capital and marketing power simultaneously, while the establishment of the Reedy Creek Improvement District in Florida revealed how governance itself could be innovated to serve corporate vision. Each of these moments, born from risk and often from crisis, altered not only the destiny of Walt Disney Productions, but also the standards by which the entertainment industry operates. They reveal a pattern. Walt's greatest strengths emerged not in times of ease, but in moments of adversity, when the weight of failure threatened to crush him, and yet instead propelled him to reinvent the rules of the game. Measured in numbers, Walt Disney's impact is staggering, yet the statistics only hint at the scale of his influence. Over the course of his career, he won 22 Academy Awards, a record that remains unmatched, reflecting not just popularity, but critical recognition of his relentless innovation. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs alone, produced at a cost of $1.49 million, earned more than $8 million in its initial release, and has since grossed hundreds of millions through reissues, proving that animated features could function as evergreen assets. By the mid-1930s, Disney merchandise generated retail sales exceeding $35 million annually, demonstrating the power of licensing to stabilize revenue during the Depression. Disneyland, built at a cost of $17 million, attracted nearly 4 million visitors in its first year, swiftly repaying its investment and establishing a model of profitability that combined entertainment with real estate. These figures, remarkable in their own time, also reveal the durability of Disney's vision. He created assets that did not simply entertain once, but could be reissued, repurposed, and re-experienced across generations. His empire was designed for longevity, with characters and stories that remained relevant, merchandise that never lost demand, and parks that invited repeated visits. The numbers speak to business genius, but behind them lay a philosophy of timelessness, an insistence that stories rooted in universal values, love, courage, wonder, would never go out of style. Ultimately, the legacy of Walt Disney cannot be reduced to films, parks, or statistics, for his true achievement lies in the way he fused creativity and enterprise into a single philosophy that continues to guide global entertainment. He proved that imagination was not the opposite of business, but its most powerful engine, that the boldest visions could be made profitable if pursued with persistence, and that art could be elevated rather than diminished by commerce. His leadership created a company culture obsessed with quality. His innovations set technological benchmarks that redefined storytelling, and his entrepreneurial courage demonstrated that risk is not something to be feared, but something to be harnessed. He left behind more than characters or castles. He left a framework for building enduring brands, a blueprint for merging narrative, technology, and place into ecosystems that captivate hearts and generate value simultaneously. Walt Disney's story is not merely the tale of a man who entertained children, but of a leader who reshaped modern culture, teaching us that dreams, when coupled with discipline and courage, can become not just personal triumphs but global legacies. His life is a testament to the power of resilience, the necessity of vision, and the enduring truth that imagination, when defended fiercely and pursued relentlessly, can alter the course of history itself.